Alright, so today is the fourth Thursday of the month, so that means that today is Why My Life Is Not a Nonprofit PSA or Infographic. Focus in on a infographic titled Why Women Are Dying to Be Thin. Or Women Are Dying to Be Thin, something like that. I'll put it, I'm going to put a link to it in the box below. So that's what we're going to focus on today. So why is my life not an infographic? So the infographic I've chosen, oh, and another thing, I'm going to put a link to rhetorical fallacies. It's an infographic, which is a useful one, in the link below, because I do utilize some of that terminology in breaking down my arguments. So let's see how it goes. So the infographic I chose today was found on Daily Infographic, which is an interesting website. They seem to be a place where they kind of compile infographics from around the web, and they post about them, and they seem to also utilize some timely information, their most recent one being on the marathon. Very interesting website, very cool, and really interesting to bring in that information all in one place. This infographic, however, was posted about 2 years ago in September in 2012, and it was one of their first posts by their contributor Rachel, and so she does a little introduction at the beginning, so I'm going to break down some of her introduction, then we're going to go right into the infographic. So her introduction is really nice, I guess. So in her first paragraph, she says, quote, after kind of introducing herself, she says, I have something that shows not only a topic that I'm interested in, but something I hope you lovely people will be able to recognize shows something about the society in which we live. Now, this is an interesting rhetorical device. She's appealing to flattery, and she's matching it with an unfounded claim, and that unfounded claim being that there's something interesting about our society that we can find out about eating disorders. And so I hope as we go through this, you'll kind of see that it's unfounded right now in the introduction because she hasn't even begun to make her case, and then later on it's still something that isn't resolved at the end. So it's still an unfounded claim. Yay, ice cream. So she starts her second paragraph with this sentence: eating disorders. Some might think that the only ones who are affected by these deathly issues are ballerinas. It's interesting. It seems to enlist an idea that there is some sort of statistic out there, though she hasn't even done any research on it to find out how many people that are affected by eating disorders are actually successful ballerinas, or dancers in general. So that is interesting. So obviously then she's going with something that is popularly believed. So it lacks the individual story of a person who actually suffers, because it's just a popular belief rather than actually hard fact or statistic. It's incredibly important when it comes to reducing stigma and raising awareness that the individual who suffers is present in the story, rather than popularly believed ideas will just perpetuate stigma. And so it also reduces the plausibility of that a person who suffers, their story could potentially be different than the one that's currently being portrayed, as it perpetuates stigma. So the plausibility of a different story is incredibly important, and that's why this infographic is just something that really irks me. So continuing on, that's just some of the beginning of what she wrote, and I'm going to move on now to the infographic because it's something that is really important that we get to. So one thing that's really prevalent with infographics, I think, and especially this one in particular, is that um, utilize it utilizes faulty deduction and content manipulation, and it can perpetuate a particular story and ignore the nuances that occur, especially as it pertains to bulimia. So we'll get to this infographic itself. Obviously, I'm outside, but I have my notes, so we're gonna go through it this way. The infographic itself starts by looking at mannequins and the differences as it compares a mannequin from 1950, like the average mannequin, to the average mannequin of 1999. And so it kind of shows the differences in waist sizes and its difference to the actual average woman of each era. It says era, but it's also like a particular year, and then they found an average. So it's an interesting statistic, so take it for what it's worth. I think one of the things that it really misses here is it's a huge gap in history, 1950 to 1999. A lot happened over the course of those years as it pertains to the fashion industry. So there's a lot of history there. And I think the fashion history is something that's really important here and really creates the sort of dynamic as to that change, and it can really create a really interesting story, and somebody can see themselves and understand maybe some of the reasons why they struggle with looking at mannequins or looking at clothing sizes, if they understand the full history of fashion and PR. So especially PR around fashion. Why was it that Twiggy was so popular in the 60s? It's little thin thing. Why did that happen when we had supposedly a more realistic mannequin? It still wasn't realistic, but it was more realistic. It's something that raises a lot of questions. So that's the first box that they have there. The second box moves down to models. And it talks about their weight and their size, but never does it really mention their eating habits or their internal dialogue. Something that I think is really important, because I think I've actually seen more models, actually met more models and actresses in that industry who struggle with eating disorders than I have actual ballerinas or eating dancers. And I've actually had to go online. So speaking from my experiences as it really pertains to people I've met in treatment, I haven't actually met that many. Yes, I've met some people who are dancers, but or not who are dancers, but people who have been in dance, but not necessarily those that have been wrapped up into the world of dancing. So it's one thing to think about. So then it moves on to publications. So one thing I want to stop here. So these three boxes that are at the top of this infographic have purely dealt with body image at this point, and not actually eating disorders or their prevalence in fashion, models, or publications. We don't hear anything about eating habits of the people who are found in those areas. We don't hear about the internal dialogues or their life stories or histories. So really all we're looking at here is body image. So we'll move down to advertisements. So it talks about teens and the prevalence in which they see advertisements as it pertains to attractiveness, and then the number of women who are attacked in advertisements dealing with dieting. It's interesting because, again, we're dealing with body image, and also we never hear the mention about boys or men. They're both that group of that gender dynamic there is something that's being perpetuated in an eating disorder infographic. It's interesting. So I think it's really important to remember that boys and men can be affected by the same things that women are being affected by. So and they're not even present in this discussion. And right now all we're discussing is body image. And I think one thing I should bring up at this point is that a little discussion about my own struggles with body image, and I think it's something that is really important here. I think body image is something I definitely struggle with. I struggle with body dysmorphic disorder, and I think that that's something that comes up in eating disorders, from body dysmorphic disorder to body image issues just in general. Maybe not something that drastic to maybe something a little less. So there's a whole range of body image issues that can come up here. And I don't think that they are the cause of eating disorders. I think it can be for some, and some being a very operative word here, but I also think that it's just something that is a continuation in the eating disorder. For me, it was something that was a catalyst for my behaviors, but was not necessarily the catalyst for the eating disorder, or even my spirals and descent into the abyss of an eating disorder. So I think that's something to keep in mind, that body image is not necessarily a causation to eating disorders. I think it is a symptom. And so there's something else there. For me, it was a lot of covering up. My body image could be covering up some of the issues. Body image could be something that was exasperated by issues I was dealing with, emotions, events that were happening in my life, things of that nature. So it's something to keep in mind that I don't necessarily see yet in this infographic, or have I seen in my story, that body image is equivalent to eating disorders. So, moving on. Perception. So now we're talking about the perception of women's bodies, and so they talk about body dysmorphic disorder, and then they also bring up a random quote about a People's Magazine poll that 80% of women stated that after watching television or a movie that they felt insecure. Now let's just make mention of, and we'll come back to, never mention why these women felt insecure. There's only a sort of insinuation by the placement in this infographic that they're talking about women's feeling insecure about their bodies. So we're sort of seeing this sort of click on in my head. I see this sort of click on in my head that we're supposed to be thinking about actresses' bodies, or even actors, because let's remember, men and boys are affected by eating disorders as well. So, and again, we're still talking about body image. So finally we get to the box at the end that states dangerous reality. And in this box we mention eating disorders, but the only specific eating disorder we mention by name is anorexia. And it is to state that 20% of people who struggle with anorexia die. So that's nice. So one of the things that this infographic, because remember, we want to look at the whole picture here. We can go in and look at each of the different statistics, but that's not what's important here. One of the things that I will always have a problem with infographics is the design fallacy. Just because it's pretty means it's true, and it's not. I think it's really important that we don't put too much stock in infographics, especially this one. I've seen it tossed around Tumblr quite a bit, and it's really important that we be mindful about these infographics, because they begin to minimize the suffering that occurs in eating disorders when we start to pick apart and see how it is still perpetuating the typical stigma that is hindering the ability of most people to get help. So that's all for today, and that's why my life is not an infographic. I will see you guys next Thursday, unless I decide to start doing updates on Sundays, which is something I've been thinking about, but we'll figure it out. See you guys next Thursday. Bye.